Hello again, everybody. It has been 2 months since I finished my through hike of the Pacific Crest Trail, and I gotta say thanks so much for the great comments and the questions that you all sent me here on YouTube, as well as Instagram and on some of the Facebook groups that I'm a member of. So based on your comments and questions, in today's video, I'm gonna cover the gear that I finished the trail with. Now, if you're interested in seeing the things that I started with, I would ask that you go back to the very first video that I made on this channel. I go into great detail about all the things that I started the trail with. Also in video number 14, I talk about the things that I swapped out about midway through the trail. And finally, I'm gonna finish today's video with talking a little bit about my preparation, my resupply strategy, and some of the things I would do differently if I were to hike the Pacific Crest Trail again. Before I get started, I need to be very clear on a couple things. First, you need to decide what gear, what preparation, and what resupply strategy works best for you. All of the things that I'm going to talk about today are what worked for me, and they may not be the best options for you. So please, learn from what I and others have to share with you, but make your own choices, because only you know what works best for you. And second, I purchased all of the gear that I used on my Pacific Crest Trail through hike. I received no sponsorship from any companies. So let me show you my gear. The pack that I finished the trail with is the Waymark Gear Company Thru. Now this is the 42 liter version, size large and extra large, and this pack worked great. I used it from the southern terminus up to Bernie, where I swapped out for a smaller pack, and then I picked this one back up and carried it all the way through Washington. And here it is with the BV 500 Bear canister for size comparison. As you can see, even after 1,900 miles, there's very minimal signs of use on this. This pack material worked great. No issues with the elastic pouch on the back. Did get a little bit sun faded, but as to be expected. Here's the other side of the pack. No issues at all with any of the buckles, the straps, the pads, or anything. This pack held up extremely well. It does come with one hip belt pouch, which fit everything that I needed inside perfectly, but all the buckles are all good. At the beginning, I had on this side a Z-Packs water bottle holder that I found later on. I just wasn't using, so I took that off. I did, however, keep the whole time. This is from Waymark Gear also. It's called the Stretch Shoulder Pouch. Worked very well. Has elastic on it that held up. This is where I kept my phone, snacks, and some other things. Right up here on this loop is where I would keep my inReach, and I found that it was out of the way. Didn't bump me in the chin or anything as I was looking around. Fit perfectly right there. Now the X-Pack material that this is made of right here, although not technically waterproof, I had no problems at all with any sweat coming through. So no sweat came through this pack, and after talking to several other hikers on the trail with packs that were made by different manufacturers, some of them had a little bit of that perspiration go through and get some of their things wet. So overall, this was an awesome pack for me. With this pack in particular, anything over 30 pounds started to get uncomfortable for me. Since it's frameless, there's nothing to provide some rigidity or stability to help distribute that weight. So was very comfortable right around 25 pounds or below, but it did get a little bit uncomfortable over that. The other thing is I sweat a lot, and this, because it does not have a pad, all that sweat would head down south, and I did have some chafing issues that went away pretty quickly with the help of some Body Glide and some Desitin, but something for you all to think about if you're going to a frameless or a pack that does not have a pad here. And inside the pack, I would always have a Nylafume liner. Here's a quick look at the things I had inside my hip belt pouch. Hand sanitizer, a small pill case where I would put Tylenol or ibuprofen that I would use throughout the day, and I would keep the larger containers inside my first aid kit. Some lip balm, a lighter, small Swiss Army knife, my electrolytes for the day. Sometimes I would have a little coffee packet in there as well. And I found very useful a small notepad and pen for writing down numbers and things as I was getting ready to go into town or taking notes on hours or just whatever I needed for. And finally, a mask for when I was going in a place where I would need that. Here's my Waymark Evolve. It's a 35-liter pack, and I used it from Bernie up to Cascade Lock, so about 735 miles. I found this great when I was trying to move really quickly and go light. 3 days of food in this thing was perfect. 4 was kind of pushing it for comfort. As I'll show you on the other side, it is only shoulder straps. It does not have a hip belt. Same as with my Thru, all the buckles, all the straps, and all the pads held up great. No excessive signs of wear on this. It's made out of the same material, that X-Pack. Also on this one, used that same shoulder pouch and found it to work out great. I used my Z-Packs Altiplex tent throughout the entire trip and loved it. The lightweight, how small it can get, and how it fits inside of my pack. Just the little bit of space that it takes inside a camp, especially when you go into one that's crowded. The pitch takes you a little bit to learn that, but once you get it, sets up really quick and easy. The space inside I enjoyed. Just under 6'1", and I could actually kneel inside of this tent. It is a single wall tent, so there were some issues with condensation. Even when I picked the best campsite I could, sometimes I had to close the doors and a little bit of condensation would build up. The good thing is it has mesh around the perimeter, and most of that condensation will drip right out. And what I did, I used the pack towel that I have in my cook kit that I'll show you later to wipe down the inside. Not too much of a problem when I had condensation. I will say one minor thing is from time to time when the foot box of my quilt would touch the side of the tent, if it had condensation on it, it would get a little bit wet. But good thing is this thing dries out super fast. If you have a little bit of sun or a breeze throughout the day, lay it out for a few minutes and it works good. Now it has 10 guy lines, and typically I would only use 6 of those unless it got really windy. Now you can see up on the right there, I have the footprint that goes along with this tent. Now the material on the bottom of Z-Packs tents are extremely thick and durable. Never had any problems with things poking through. I brought that footprint primarily to use when cowboy camping, and if I were to do it over, I would not bring that. That thing is very narrow, and I found that when I laid on it, my quilt would come off the sides, go in the dirt and the dust, and I didn't like that. If I were to do it again, I would bring a piece of Tyvek that's a little bit wider, so I wouldn't have to worry about my quilt touching the ground, and I could also put a few things off the ground next to me. Now I had the MSR mini groundhog stakes. Those things work great. You can see just a little bit of wear on the tips of those. I did bend that one that's on the left when I was pounding it with a rock, but those things held up great. Even up in the Sierra, where I was unable to pound stakes into the ground, I would just set them sideways, wrap the guy lines around it, and use a rock, and I found that to be perfect. And those tents went in, or those tent stakes went inside a Hilltop Packs stake holder. Here's a look at my sleep system. So on the top, I have the Enlightened Equipment Enigma quilt. This one is rated to 20 degrees, and for those of you that might be buying a quilt or a sleeping bag for the first time, I highly recommend that you get on that manufacturer's website or give them a call to find out how they determine their temperature ratings. There are some differences between manufacturers, and these things are very expensive. So I think you ought to get on there and figure out what you're getting into before paying all that money. I chose black on the inside and navy blue on the outside. So if I had to put it out in the sun to get some of the moisture or condensation off of it, it would dry quickly, and it worked out perfect. Inside the Z-Packs big dry sack is where I kept everything, and that's what you see right there. Helped me compress it down and protect it. Now on the bottom left, I have the Sea to Summit Eros Ultralight Pillow. That's the size large. I used that throughout the entire trip and loved it. Now in the middle there, I have the Sea to Summit Cotton and Silk Sleeping Bag Liner. This for me was perfect. I used it primarily as protection for my quilt. So at the end of a long day, if I'm sweaty, if I'm dirty or grimy, I don't have to worry about getting that onto my quilt. It also added a little bit of thermal value when it was cold outside, prevented a little bit of draft from coming in underneath my quilt. And I also found that I used it just to sleep in by itself in some of the hotter areas on the trail. I would just wash that when I went into towns with my laundry, and it worked out great. Now over here, I finished with the Nemo Tensor. Now I used this for a few hundred miles on the trail after having problems with 4 Thermarest pads. So I had valve issues with 2 of the X lights and some lateral seam debonding issues with 2 Uber lights. So even though this is a much heavier pad, I found it to be great for me. I got great sleep, and I'm very happy with my decision, regardless of the additional weight. And then underneath there is the Gossamer Gear 1/8 inch closed cell foam pad that I would put inside my tent under everything to prevent things from sliding around on the floor of the tent. Also, I'm sure it added a little bit of insulative value, but not much. During the day, I would use this for a sit pad, or if I was laying down anytime during the day to take a nap or stretch, I found that thing to be perfect and very, very comfortable. For almost 1,000 miles, so from Donner Pass up to Cascade Locks, I used this UGQ Bandit 40-degree quilt. Primarily swapped it out because of the higher temperatures, and I really like the flexibility of this quilt because as you can see down the center there, they have a zipper to where you can open this up all the way. And down on this end, I loosened it a little bit so you can see those cord locks on that shock cord, so you could actually open up that foot box as well. And when you open this thing all the way up, it forms a rectangle and provides you some flexibility if you want to just cover up with that and ventilate throughout the night if it's a little bit chilly but still warm at the same time. Really like this quilt. It was light and compressible and would definitely use this again. The poles I used were the Canuck carbon fiber cork handle trekking poles. One of the biggest selling points for me on these is they extend out long enough for the Altiplex tent. Now the Altiplex requires a 56-inch pole to set up, so these worked out great for me. I found though in Northern California that I really wasn't using my poles, so I sent one of them home and kept the other one and used it only to set up my tent for the duration of the trip from Northern California north. I took off the straps, didn't find that I used those. If I were to do it again, also the baskets on the bottom, I would have taken those off in Southern California in the desert because these were constantly getting caught up in the brush, and I didn't even think about removing those until I was through the desert. But great poles. I just found that me personally, I didn't use them that much. Here are the things that I kept on my outside elastic pouch on my pack. Starting with the upper left, the Ketadine Be Free. Used this for about 1,000 miles on the trail and really liked the flow rate. I never had any of the problems that some other folks have talked about. I just didn't experience that. When I wasn't using this, I was using the Sawyer Squeeze. And I found that to be a great one too, but as soon as I started using this Be Free, I really like the flow rate on this one much better. Sunblock, and this is basically my hygiene stuff right here, the sunblock, the toothpaste, and the toothbrush. I would have that in a Ziploc bag separate. Also the Deuce trowel there, I would have that in a small Ziploc bag with toilet paper as well. Wallet that I use to keep my permit, credit cards, cash, ID, stamps, and various other things. I found it really easy just to slide that down inside the outside pack so I could access it. A Z-Packs pack cover, only used that a few times as you saw in the videos, but always glad that I had that. My electronics kit, which I'll go into a little bit more detail here in a little bit, as well as my first aid kit. And then I would keep my, even though I talked about these earlier, would keep these on the outside of my pack because I didn't want them poking anything inside. Here are the other things that I would keep on the outside of my pack. So in the side pockets, I would keep my water bottles, one on each side. The black capped one I used for anything flavored. So my coffee or my electrolytes, I would make in that. And I would always keep clear, unflavored water in the bottle with the clear cap. Down there is my tripod, which is the Petco UltraPod 3 and has a Manfrotto clamp on the top of it. I would keep that on the outside as well. And then there's my InReach that I would keep on my left shoulder strap. I already went pretty deep into detail about my thoughts on this piece of equipment in video number 14. Check that out if you're more interested in that. But what I will say is these things work great when there is open skies and no tree cover, but they do not work as well in areas where there's tree cover or very mountainous terrain when you're down deep in valleys. So know what you're getting into before you buy one of those. Here's everything inside of my electronics bag that I finished with. On the upper left is just a standard Anker 10,000 milliamp battery bank. I put stickers on it because I learned very early on when there's a whole bunch of people trying to charge their stuff in the same place, sometimes it's difficult to figure out which battery bank is yours. Right beneath that is the Anker 18-watt charger. And on the very bottom is my Nitecore NU25 headlamp. I like this because of the brightness settings. I could use that if I'm on the trail at night or in the morning. Also a red lens for when I was in camp or inside of my tent. On the top center there, just a standard iPhone charging setup with the brick and the cable. And then down in the center there is the cable that came with the battery. All of that was kept in the Hilltop Packs dual pocket gadget bag, and it protected everything throughout the entire trip. And here's a look inside my maintenance / first aid kit. On the upper left there, I have my maintenance kit with a little thing of super glue, various tape from the different manufacturers that I had gear from, and a small Z-Packs repair kit inside there. Then I have my fingernail clippers. I found that I was unable to cut my fingernails with the Swiss Army knife, so I just brought those instead. Aquaphor, I use that for a whole bunch of different things, including cuts and scrapes and a couple of little minor burns. KT tape, I kept that just in case I formed a blister or a hot spot, some Band-Aids, and a safety pin. Now throughout the trip, I carried some picaridin insect repellent and some Tecnu just in case I came across some poison oak and ivy. I did use all of those at certain times throughout the trip, and I would just have some of those small packets in my resupply boxes. Down there on the right, I have just small pouches of triple antibiotic, burn cream, and things like that. Never got into those things. And then I kept everything inside a Hilltop Packs, one of their ultralight roll top dry bags. I brought National Geographic maps with me all the way through Washington. This is the one that I finished with that covers the northern half of the state. I did not use or bring paper maps with me for the entire trail. However, because of the fire activity in Washington, where the fires were very close to the trail and the closure areas had the Pacific Crest Trail as the closure boundary, I decided to bring these. And what I did was look at the PCT trail closure page and wrote in these maps exactly where the closures are and where I could go in case I ran into trouble. So basically evac corridors, I had those drawn out inside and I knew exactly where I needed to go before I hit the trail. I use my phone for navigation, communication, all of my photos and videos, and for making all of my YouTube videos. It's the standard iPhone 11, but I got the model with 256 gigs of storage, so I wouldn't have to worry about running out of space on the phone with all the videos and photos that I was taking. I used an Otter Defender Series Pro case for the phone, and I found that to provide great protection for it, as well as it had really good grip if my hands were cold or wet, and I could also stand it up on rocks and trees and things like that when I was filming video without having to use my tripod. I never let the battery get below 25%, and I found that I could get 4 full charges from 25% out of that Anker 10,000 milliamp battery, in addition to 1 charge for my Garmin InReach. A few other points on my phone. I would keep it in airplane mode during the day and still be able to use Guthook, Garmin EarthMate, and Gaia for navigation. Now, when I would get into camp, that is when I would charge my phone. So it would be fully charged and fresh in the morning, and one less thing I have to deal with during the day. I would typically turn the phone off at nighttime, and I would keep it close to me or under my quilt if it was cold outside. As far as the apps that I used during my hike, the one I used the most was Guthook, now known as Far Out. I used that for navigation. I used it to get information about water sources. I I used it to get information about the towns that I was going into, and one of the features I liked the most was the ability for other hikers and myself to share information through the comments that they could leave. One important detail to remember when using Far Out: it works best if you're in town and on a Wi-Fi network if you're trying to download the photos and map layers for each section of the trail. The cellular network on the trail is not very dependable in some areas, and you won't be able to download those things using cellular. Second to Far Out, I use Garmin EarthMate with my inReach. The thing I used that for the most was texting. Occasionally I would also use it for weather, but I found that I very rarely used it for tracking, and I never used it for navigation. Another app that I used actually a lot was called Seek by iNaturalist. It's a plant and animal identification app. It uses photo recognition, and I found it very useful for identifying flowers, poisonous plants, insects, and some animals. Specific to my YouTube videos, the editing app that I used is called LumaFusion. I also used YouTube to upload the videos, Fonto to make the thumbnails for my videos, and YouTube Studio to upload those thumbnails onto the videos. A valuable lesson I learned early on about uploading YouTube videos is that it's important that you disable everything else that's going to use up that Wi-Fi. I didn't realize that at first, and it was taking a very long time to upload YouTube videos because I had automatic downloads for my apps as well as my photos uploading to iCloud. Here's my food storage and cooking setup. So on the top, I have the Hilltop Packs large food bag. And on the right, you see there, I have the hanging kit. Basically, it has the rock bag and 50 feet of Dyneema line inside of it. On the bottom left, you see I have the Optimus Crux Light stove. I swapped out in Idyllwild after using the BRS stove. Although very light, I found it to be very inefficient as far as being able to control the flame and the amount of fuel it used. Although very light, I decided I didn't want that thing anymore. Then you have the Toaks Titanium 750 milliliter pot, which worked great for me. Most of the food that I used was freeze-dried or dehydrated. Anytime I would cook ramen or something like that, I wouldn't actually cook it in the pot. I would boil the water, put everything into a 1 quart freezer or Ziploc bag, and then put it back inside the pot just so I could eat it without making a mess. Then there's the lid and the carrying case, of course. Then there's that pack towel that I talked about when I was discussing my tent. I kept it inside of the pot with my cook kit so I could use it as a hot glove so I wouldn't burn my fingers on the handles. But I would also use it, like I said, to wipe down that condensation inside of my tent. And on the bottom there, I have the Toaks Titanium long-handled spoon with the polished bowl. Now I would put this stove set up and I could fit 5 days worth of food inside this bag. Starting with the clothes that I had inside of my pack. So on the right, I have the Enlightened Equipment Torrid Apex jacket with the hood. I carried that thing throughout the entire trail. I didn't mind the additional weight because at nighttime, I would use it when it was really cold. I would put it in my quilt with me if I didn't have it on. And I would also use it when it was warmer just to cover up my shoulders if I got cold. Down in the center there is a standard buff. That's the merino wool one. I would use that sometimes if it was cold to sleep in. Also, with the Z-Packs tent being so thin as far as the material, the moonlight would come in a lot. So I would use this actually as a blindfold sometimes. And then I have on the left there the Smart Wool, I think it's called the Lid beanie. I would sleep in that thing as well as wearing it sometimes outside. Those outdoor research, they're really lightweight gloves. I never wore them, but I always kept them inside my pack just in case. Continuing on with the clothing items that I had inside of my pack, on the right is the Patagonia R1. That's the hooded version that I found very useful for sleeping in and hiked in a couple times actually as temperatures started to get cold up in Washington. Top center is a pair of mid-weight Capilene long underwear. I wore those a few times sleeping up in Washington when it was really cold. Also the Enlightened Equipment Sidekick booties that are on the top left there. I would pack those inside of the dry bag with my quilt. On the bottom there, I have the extra pairs of socks that I had. the Injinji, that's the merino wool version, toe socks or liner socks that I would wear underneath the Smart Wool midweight hiking socks. And then the additional pair of ex officio underwear that I kept with me throughout the trip. And the last two things that I had inside my pack were the Z-Packs Virtus rain jacket and pants. Now for the pants, I very rarely even wore those. I didn't wear them hiking. I would wear them in camp sometimes or when I was in a laundromat doing laundry. Z-Packs Virtus rain jacket. I wore that in the rain several times and never wetted through. It was a great jacket, but mostly I wore that for an additional level of wind protection or when it got really cold for an additional layer on the outside. The only issue I had with the rain jacket was, as you can see right here, that's basically on the center of my back. The seam tape started to come off as I entered Washington. Easy stuff. Z-Pack sent me some seam tape that I'm going to fix that later. I also had some up. This is the shoulder area. That's the tag on the back of your neck. Easy stuff to fix. And again, it never wetted through, so this was a great product. For the clothing I was wearing when I finished the trail, I'm going to work from the bottom up, starting with my shoes. These are the Ultra Olympus 4s. Now, if you watch my videos, you'll know that I went through actually 8 pairs of shoes. So 3 pairs of Ultra Olympus 4s, 4 pairs of Ultra Lone Peaks, and for a very short period of time, I was wearing a pair of Timps, but those went out really quick and I had to get rid of those. My approach to rotating shoes was doing that about every 400 miles to make sure I didn't have any problems in the middle of nowhere where I couldn't get a quick fix. And I'm really glad that I did that. Now, the reason I like the Olympus 4s a little bit better than the Lone Peaks is these have a 33 millimeter stack height as compared to the 25 millimeter stack height that are on the Lone Peaks. And I appreciate that little extra bit of cushioning, especially on rocky terrain and when I was in the Sierras. One thing to note about the Olympus 4s is they run a little bit smaller than the Lone Peaks. So for the Lone Peaks, I wear a size 13. I had to size up to a 14 in these to get that same feel and to make sure that my toes didn't hit the front of the shoes as I was going downhill or moving fast. For socks, I had the Injinji liners, and I went through 5 pairs of these while I was on the trail. I tried the Cool Max version for a little bit, but found that I like the merino wool, which is what these are, version much better. For my socks, I had the Darn Tough quarter cushion socks, and I went through 5 pairs of these as well, and found that those were perfect for what I needed. And finally, the gaiters. So I went through 2 pairs of these. I absolutely shredded 1 pair in the desert and up in the Sierra. So I rotated out to another pair, and these brought me from Northern California all the way up to Washington, and I'm glad I used gaiters the whole way. The shorts I wore throughout the hike and finished with are just a standard pair of Nike running shorts. I can't remember the model name. I know Nike has several to choose from, but I like to cut out the liners so I can swap between 2 pairs of underwear that I bring with me. And here are those ex officio boxer briefs. I like these because they dry out quickly if you have to do laundry in a sink or a stream, and they're extremely comfortable and prevent chafing. Now, the hoodie that I finished the trail with actually developed a hole in it on a seam, so I returned it to REI. But my favorite hoodie for the entire trip was the Rab Pulse hoodie. I was wearing that in California all the way up through Washington, so I just ordered another one. Super light, dries out really quickly, and provides adequate protection from the sun. And early on, actually all the way through the trip, I always had with me a pair of Outdoor Research sun gloves. Use these all the time in the desert and the Sierra. Started wearing them a little bit less when I got up into Northern California and Oregon and I had some tree cover, but I kept them with me, and I'm glad that I did because I used them as a kind of a warming glove when I was up in Washington. And finally, the hat that I finished with was a Renegade Cool ball cap. I liked using this because it provided a little bit of sunshade for my face and also prevented the hoodie from coming down into my eyes. And I also have to mention the hat that, although I didn't finish with it, I wore for the majority of the trail, and that's the Shelta Seahawk hat. This was absolutely great. It has a rigid brim so it doesn't fall down in your face. The sides kept my ears and then the back of my neck protected. It's very thin material. I chose to get the lightest color to prevent the heat from building up when I was walking through the desert and up in the Sierras. The strap is perfect. I can take it off if I want to, and the clip in the center right there is actually kind of square so it didn't dig into my chin. Absolutely loved this hat. One more thing I want to talk about is the permethrin that I use to treat my clothes and some of my gear. Now, I use this for all of my clothes, used it properly, which means you have to soak it and then let it dry. But I also used it on the screen mesh of my tent for the doors and the perimeter that went around there. I would also cover my gaiters, my socks, my hats, my sun gloves, and all those things. And I found that many times when I'd look to my right and left and see other hikers just getting eaten alive by mosquitoes, I was not having a problem. Now I'm going to talk about some of the things that I did to prepare for my thru hike. The number one resource I used to prepare was Yogi's Pacific Crest Trail Handbook. I read this thing from cover to cover several times, completely disassembled it. I actually took the back piece apart and scanned it into sections and saved it onto my phone so I could reference it while I was on the trail. Extremely valuable resource, and I will leave the link below so you can find this. Second to that, I use Half Mile's trail notes, resupply notes, elevation profiles, and overview maps, and I'll also leave the link to those below. Just as with Yogi's book, I also kept PDF copies of that on my phone so I could reference it throughout the trail. And some of those documents I even sent to myself in resupply boxes so I could look over those before hitting some sections of the trail. As far as physical and mental preparation go, bottom line, I got outside with my full pack on and put in some miles. I went out when it was hot, when it was cold, when it was raining, when it was snowing, when it was windy. The harsher the conditions, the more I got out of it. I spent over 100 miles dialing in my sock and shoe combo, and I'm glad that I did because I didn't get one single blister on the trail. I spent time figuring out what order I needed to put things in my pack so I could get to things easily when I needed them on the trail and in camp. I practiced setting up and tearing down camp when it was windy outside, when it was raining, when my hands were numb, so I wouldn't be surprised when I ran into any of those conditions on the trail. Even though I live in Illinois where the elevation is low and terrain is flat, I benefited from and was better prepared for the trail because of all those things I just mentioned. And regardless of where you live, getting outside and doing some of those things I just talked about will better prepare you as well. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about my resupply strategy. I would get any variety that I needed or satisfy any of those food cravings I had when I would stop in towns and go to local restaurants. I used resupply boxes for most of my trip. I found that saved me time and allowed me the opportunity to enjoy my Neros and Zeros a little bit more because I didn't have to worry as much about shopping. But to make sure I didn't get tired of the things that I bought, I didn't buy everything at once. So I made an initial purchase while I was at home and sent several resupply boxes all the way through the desert. Then when I got up to South Lake Tahoe, I made a bunch of boxes for Northern California and sent those forward. I did the same thing when I got to Ashland for the boxes that I needed in Oregon. And finally, when I got into Cascade Locks, I went down to Portland and bought everything I needed for the resupply boxes I used up in Washington. I'll put a list in the description of the places where I sent resupply boxes. And one thing you might notice, especially in Northern California and Oregon, is some of those stops were actually pretty close. Now, as I was trying different things to go faster and lighter, I found out that I could move quicker and get more mileage with 2 or 3 day resupplies rather than 4 or 5 day resupplies. All of that was intentional, and I'm glad that I tried those things out because they worked very well for me. And 2 final points on resupply boxes. First, if you choose to go that route, make sure that you know the days and operating hours for all of the post offices that you send your resupply boxes to so you don't get any surprises. Second, what I noticed this year was that in the past, general delivery boxes would be held for 30 days. However, at 5 different post offices along the PCT this year, it was only 2 weeks. Fortunately, I looked up on the tracking numbers to pay attention to where my boxes were, and you will see a notification that you have to pick it up by a certain date. I was able to call all of those post offices, and they were nice enough to hold it for me. But it's something that I didn't expect and something that was different than what I'd been told in the past. And I'm going to finish today's video with a few things that I would do differently if I were to hike the Pacific Crest Trail again. First and foremost, I would slow down. It took me 144 days to complete my thru hike, and 120 of those were actual hiking days. I would take more time to enjoy the views, especially up in the Sierras where I was doing 20+ mile days, and I actually had a few 2-pass days. Also up in Washington, I would have slowed down a lot and enjoyed it more, because as I got closer to the end, I got excited and got in a bit of a rush where I should have been slowing down to enjoy that last little bit of the experience. I would take more photos and videos with the people that I shared the trail with. Now, I really enjoyed those times where I was hiking around people or talking to folks when we were in town or in camp or just meeting along the trail. But for whatever reason, I was hesitant to stop and take the time to get some photos and video with those folks. And speaking of photos, I would take more photos of the scenery and landscape that I enjoyed. Now, I noticed in certain sections, I was really focusing on video and I wasn't taking a lot of photos. So what I'm doing now is going back to those videos and taking screen caps so I can have photos of that scenery and landscape that I enjoyed so much. And finally, I would have taken better care of myself with regards to mobility and flexibility while I was on the trail. Very early on, I stopped warming up and stretching in the morning and stretching when I would get into camp at night. In the mornings, I would get up, eat, break down camp, and get right on the trail. Same thing at night. As soon as I got into camp, I would eat, set up, and go right to sleep without taking very good care of myself. Fortunately, I didn't experience any significant injuries while I was on the trail, but now that I'm home, I have a lot of muscle tightness, some joint pain, and some plantar fasciitis that I think wouldn't be as bad if I would have worked on some mobility and flexibility while I was still on the trail. So that's it. Hopefully you found some information in this video that you will find helpful. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments below and I'll do my best to provide you an answer as quick as I can. As always, thank you all so much for watching this video and my entire PCT journey. And for the folks that are getting ready for their thru hike, I wish you all the best.